speaking of upsets and talking about like slipping in the
Oh, you want to talk about
standings.
vitality? Hello, lovely esports friends. Wolf and I are back one more time to talk about what else? The LCK here on the Monte and Wolf Show. We've got a lot of topics, I think, to cover this week, especially, I don't know, Dplus looking a lot better, Hanhwa Life finally going up against a tougher opponent and kind of failing. Where do you have another topic you want to start with, Wolf? Anything that has been particularly interesting to you?
I mean, I think we've seen the evolution of this patch really end up being pretty fun. Like, we've seen a little bit more melee supports. We're seeing more Aphelios Thresh. We're seeing the Gragas flex, like, both continue to do well, but also, like, get a little bit countered. Like, we're seeing some answers to this. And just in general, I feel like this patch has been, for me, my favorite so far in the LCK. Because we had a lot of, like, Lulu, Zeri, Lucianami all the time. Now we still have that, like, it's still viable, but all these other picks are viable. The double 80 bot lane is still viable, but you can go back to, like, Aphelios Thresh, you can play Jinx, so right now I'm pretty stoked with, like, the variety we're seeing in the LCK, and this week was really cool for that.
We've also answered the question of what happens when you ban 880 carries in a single game of Liiv SANDBOX versus KT match number 2, game number 2. That was very exciting. You know, I guess.
So I guess we can talk about Dplus KIA first. I'm really I think I've been kind of trapped in my own headspace about Dplus KIA. Like, I feel like I'm not ready to trust that they're good, but they keep winning. They keep being consistent. And they have so many strong draft picks, like the Kana Renekton, Def's Lucian, for example, Showmaker's LeBlanc, that you really have to respect. Showmaker's Lissandra, so the LeBlanc pick, very difficult to pick blind into him. So I always feel like if Def doesn't have Caitlyn or Lucian, this team looks weaker. It always feels that way, because it always feels like then Canyon has to pick up the pieces in the other lanes, because if Def doesn't have strong bot side, things get very messy. But we're still seeing that it's so difficult to actually prevent that from happening for Def without giving over so many other critical picks to Dplus. So they seem like such a strong team that's so versatile right now. I will apologize to everyone. I'm a little bit sick, so my voice sounds like very scratchy and froggy. Yeah, I'm kind of high on them right now a little bit, actually. I feel like I'm ready to break the chains of, like, Def can only do it if he has strong bot side. And then teams are still giving him strong bot side, like Hanwha Life are like, yeah, we're down to play against his Lucian, that's fine. You shouldn't be down to play against Def's Lucian. He's 8-0 on it now. So stop giving him this pick. Well, but then you can't give Connor Renekton, so, like...
Ooh, I don't know. I think you can give Connor Renekton. I think I think if we're going to talk about Hanwha Life versus Dplus, and it's important that this series is particularly important just because Hanwha has been on a pretty big win streak, but they've done it against all 4 teams. Like, their last 5 matches, because remember, it goes from one round robin to the next, have been against teams that are now mathematically eliminated from the playoffs, right?
Yeah.
Their last loss was also to Dplus, and then the match before that they played BRION. So they literally have gotten all of the bottom 4 teams in the second round robin already, and now their only matches left are against the 4 remaining playoff teams that are not Dplus. So we are going to learn a lot about Hanwha Life in the next week, but I think in this matchup, I was pretty disappointed. I did a VOD review in my stream earlier today, and I was pretty disappointed in what Hanwha Life actually ended up getting in this draft and their draft strategy, which was to take the Caitlyn, but then it's answered by Deft on Jinx. And then because Karma and Lux are both banned, they end up with a Heimerdinger with the Caitlyn. So then Kellen picks the Kalista into it, right? And so there isn't the same pressure that's coming out of this bot lane. And they give away the Elise into Canyon, and Canyon has been really revitalized since we've seen, the return of the Lee Sin, the return of the Elise, the Nidalee. Now we're seeing the Viego come back into vogue as well when some of these other junglers are banned. So when he's on these early game junglers, it makes a lot of sense. And Deft is a legendary Jinx player. And if you can give him a chance to just kind of get away with that in a free lane versus Caitlyn Eimer, you see what happens. And also they gave up. I know you talk about Kanna's Renekton as being must ban, but you ban Sion and Ornn in the second part of this draft when you take the Jace. You just let him have the Renekton. Who gives a fuck about the Renekton? Just get rid of the Sion, because that's actually the thing that you're most concerned about when you have the Jace, and you're really reliant on poke damage.
And then also Kingen lost to Comet Sion super hard in the lane. Like, he lost super early. It was really bad. Like, that you can I mean, I agree with you. I don't think you should give the Sion and the Ornn over in this matchup. Excuse me, but they gave Kanna the Sion, and then he picked Comet and then just crushed lane, and Kingen was like under his turret and couldn't play the game. Like, he got hit by a Q, like an empowered Q early, and then just was like, I can't play anymore. It's done. Like, and so like you can lose or you can not win. Like you can concede, like you're not going to have top prio and you're not going to actually get CS advantage. Like, you can concede that, but you can't actually lose lane to the Sion. Like, Kingen had a really uncharacteristically bad series. He had a really weak game of Ornn as well in the second game. And like, he was playing bad. Bottom side, you had the weak Heimerdinger, so you couldn't actually dominate that lane. Even though Kellen's performance on the Kalista wasn't amazing, it was good enough. So you're not controlling bottom side. You have the Annie who's going to control mid, and then you lost lane top side. Then in the second game, you gave Showmaker the counter pick, Lissandra. You just walked right into that one. Like, it was so obvious. Deft got Lucian, and then Kingen loses lane again to the Jace on the top side, and you're like, well, why'd you draft like this, and then why'd you play like this? It's so sad to see so many of these games decided in the LCK, especially in the last 2 weeks, I feel, by bad drafting from teams that could otherwise play a competitive series. And I don't want to call this bad drafting, but I think it was pretty weak. Like, it was pretty obvious the traps that were set by Dplus, and they kind of walked into them. It wasn't like KT bad from last week where you're like, what is this? Like, what are you doing? It wasn't that bad, but it felt like Dplus had a good read on this. And like, picking the LeBlanc into open Lissandra when Showmaker is like the best Lissandra player in the LCK right now, it just felt, I don't know, it just felt super obvious. Like, we were all watching the draft yelling at the TV. Like, I was on the desk with Huni that day, and we were just like yelling like, no, they're going to pick Lissandra. What are you doing? Like, it was just like, I don't know. It just felt super weak.
It's also that there were options of things to pick. Like, you could always just take the Azir. Like, I get that Zeka isn't necessarily the greatest Azir player in the universe, but there's a safe way to do these drafts on blue side. And if you want to prioritize getting Clid on the Lee Sin, which he has been good at, but I do feel in certain ways, and this is why, guys, despite the massive winning streak, Hanwha hasn't been on my top 10 of the global power rankings, because it's been weeks since we've seen them play a good team. And the last time they did, they also got 2-0'd by Dplus. And I feel like even Hanwha have gotten false data, because as we've talked about on this show, Hanwha has been going back towards a tank top, front to back team fighting with an early game jungle. I think I will say that that's the mix up there, is that Clid has been very good on Lee Sin and Vi. So he helps prop up the lanes early on. And then they kind of play a traditional front to back team fighting style. Viper's been very dominant in the lane, but I think they got some false data, because earlier this week they played Nongshim, and that's when we see like Kingen back on the Jace top and Zeka on the Gragas mid, right? Zeka on the Jace mid. Those were Zeka's first time playing either of those champions, and he did very well. But I think they got ahead of themselves, and they started to think, oh, we can actually play these style of compositions against other playoff teams. And even though they flipped back to Ornn in the third game of the series, the LeBlanc just feels totally out of left field, and was pretty easily countered, like you say, by the R5 Lissandra pick. And then also Showmaker got a lead in that lane, which was even worse because the skirmishing really went their way in the early game. So he was actually able to get a kill. Even though he did, he gave up first blood to a turret dive, but they traded it back for Clid. And Clid was really kind of useless that game, but you're just not going to get the chance to scale either against good teams. I mean, if you look at the way that T1 is playing right now, do you think you're going to get a chance to scale? The answer is no.
Yeah,
You're not.
it's weird because it feels disrespectful, right? In a weird way. Like it feels like you're like, oh no, I could beat Def Solution and like we can play LeBlanc here. And Zeka, I don't know who made the call. Like on a lot of teams, Zeka says I want to play LeBlanc, and the coach is like, I don't know, but they might have Lissandra, and Zeka's like, trust me, I can handle this. I'm going to do this. And sometimes the coach will be like, okay, like that's one way this can go. There's the other way where a coach tells a player like, I want you to do this, and the player says like, hell no, I'm not doing that. He's gonna play Lissandra, and I don't know which one happened in this case, for example, but it does feel concerning. And my theory is the coach said like, I want you to play this, and we're gonna actually get picks on the back line. It's a Nami composition. They won't get vision. We have this Lee Sin. We're gonna get ahead. We have this setup where we're gonna get some mid game fights, and then we're gonna push vision in a little bit hard, and like you're gonna have this power with Lisa and LeBlanc to actually get some kills and get some pressure on. That's what I think the coaching staff thought, which I don't agree with, but I think maybe that's what they were thinking. And then they fell behind and it was useless. But it's like trying to do that, trying to play LeBlanc into a Lucian comp in the first place really requires you to have strong win conditions elsewhere and not have like just Ornn topside, because you could win a team fight with Ornhorn and like some really insane mechanical plays from Zeka, maybe, but it's not going to be easy. And if you lose those fights and fall behind, like which you will, it's Def Solution, then you're just like, this comp does nothing. And maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the coaching staff was like, hey, Zeka, I really think we should play Azir here. It's great. We have Ornn Azir in the mid game. We can deal with these Lucian fights pretty well. You know, second Drake is going to be like really nice for us. And then we're going to scale incredibly well. We already have the Ornn. So you have the Azir Leandri's damage to kind of poke through and then eventually win those fights. And then Zeka was like, I really don't want to play Azir. Let me play LeBlanc. Like that also could have been what happened. The coach staff's like, what about Lissandra? And he's like, nah, trust me. Like that could have also occurred. One of these two things happened, right? Though I think, and it's neither of them are good. And I think that we talked about this all last week, and it's still continued to be true that both Zeka and Kingen aren't leaders on their own. They're not shot calling. They're following kind of Klid's main shot calling, and you see it in these drafts where like the players themselves feel like they're just following a recipe that was given to them in a lot of ways, or like they've taken a draft they like, but then they don't know how to use it. They're like, I like this champion. I don't really know what it does in this composition, though. And that's kind of been the problem for Hanwha a lot this season. And I don't trust that. Like, I think right now they're in a solid fifth for me. I'm like, yep, they're just above Liiv SANDBOX. They're below KT, Dplus, and GenG. Like, they're a solid fifth place for me right now. And I don't think that anything is going to change my mind about that this late into the season.
Yeah, I think that as good as Hanhwa Life has been, and especially when we look at the way that they played against Nongshim earlier this week, it was easy to get hyped about them. But this is the true test now. Maybe they just have a bad matchup versus Dplus. And I also think, to Dplus's credit, Canna has looked a lot better in the last, recently. They seem to be gelling better as a team. But I don't even know how much I want to read into the wins, because last week when Dplus played against KT decided to take the Lucian Nami themselves as a takeaway. So instead of doing what you said earlier, which was give it to Dplus when they're so good at it, they decided to take it away, even though they were bad at it. And it felt like KT
they're
was
really
trying
bad
to,
at it.
they were trying to pretend to be Dplus instead of just, I don't know, playing their own style, which they did much more, as we'll talk about when they played against like GenG and Liiv SANDBOX this week. But at the same time, like I think Dplus is, you may be right in that there are there may now be too many solid picks for Dplus to make it very easy to ban them out. That's one theory. But there's also the fact that other teams just seem to be either hurting themselves when play against Dplus, or giving them things that we know they're very strong at, that they don't necessarily have to give up. So I don't know how versatile I think Dplus are as a result.
Yeah, I think this is like when we started the show where I was talking about, like, for me, my mind was very closed on Dplus for so long, because I was like, this team just so obvious. If Deft gets Lucian, they win. If he gets Caitlyn, they win. If they don't, it looks a little bit shaky. Or, if Canna has some really strong power on the top lane, if he wins lane, like, it's going to be great. But if he can't do that, like, I don't know. And, so they have all these strong picks, but if they don't get these strong picks or the counters, then it feels really weak. Like, that was kind of my read for most of the season. And now I'm kind of like, maybe I shouldn't read too much into that. So I mean, there are definitely like two ways of looking at this, and I've always trusted that Dplus has, between Canyon and Showmaker, like they've been the mainstays on this team, but you know, Kellen now also kind of stepping up into a really big spot for this team. I've always believed they have really fast reads on the meta, and they're able to adapt very quickly. But I just don't think we're living in that timeline right now because T1 is the one who's leading the meta. They have figured out the meta. They're just constantly improving nonstop, and Dplus is kind of catching up with them. So I don't know what's going to happen if Dplus goes to MSI, because right now it's very obviously T1 is going to go to MSI. Is it going to be Dplus or is it going to be GenG, or like the two front runners right now? I think in terms of who could go there, maybe KT has some crazy insane run and they go, but I don't think that's going to happen. And so like, will Dplus do well at MSI? We normally predict this team to do well internationally. I don't know right now. We don't know what the patch is going to be. We don't know what the meta is going to look like. But I don't think that they'll suddenly be better than T1 going into MSI. And I also feel like their read, because the LCK is very like, we're doing the standard things, we're doing the meta, with the exception of T1 this season. I feel like they are more punishable internationally than they are in the LCK, if that makes sense, because teams are trying to like outthink them or take picks away from them instead of being creative. I think if Dplus runs into some Chinese teams or some European teams, maybe they actually lose some games at MSI because they're so set in their ways, and they have this one specific way that they're drafting right now that's really strong, but their versatility, like you say, seems low, but we'll see.
Yeah, it is weird to say that about a team that has, I mean, because last year at Worlds, you guys will remember we were saying, oh, Dom1's versatility is their greatest strength. They have these enormous champion pools. And so it seems weird to say that they aren't very versatile right now. I do have hope, because I think in game one with Canna on the Scion and the Jinx Callisto lane, that we saw more versatility from them. And I think that one of the biggest factors is Showmaker playing a lot better than he did in kind of the middle stages of the split, or weeks 4 through 6, let's say, or 4 and 5. Then he started to improve in week 6 and now week 7, where he individually looks a lot better. And Canyon feels really at home on these early game ganking junglers at the moment. So there is that. But I agree that most of the time we've seen them win, it has been through rather specific champions. I have hope, though. I think there's a glimmer of hope right now that we get back to that versatility. Canna seems to be slotting in better. His play in the macro side looks more cohesive with the rest of the team. Showmaker isn't randomly dying in a side lane and giving up a Baron. Those were really their biggest problems, right?
Also, yeah, one other thing to keep in mind too is that when we move to 13.5, there's going to be some jungle changes and some additional resources put into the jungle, and that's where Canyon really, like, he's very good at both, the melee gore drinker, boring, like Lee Sin, Xin Zhao meta type. Like, we lived through that for so long. He's very good at that, and I think that he's most famous for that for newer fans of Dplus, because like that's what it's been for so long. But he's also incredibly good if it's like a Nidalee farming, get ahead and like scale up and be aggressive in the mid game jungle game. He's good if it's just going to be like Karthus jungle and he's just going to only farm and actually play the late game. So I think that might actually give some opportunities for some additional diversity too. If we do see those changes to the jungle actually allow for that kind of farming carry style jungle meta, because that part of Canyon getting World's MVP was that sort of jungle play. So I think that it could be good, the new patch for Dplus, and that might like really solidify them in second place and put them to that second round robin. So just something else to consider here, as maybe they're kind of playing a predictable style, quote unquote, right now, because they know there's some changes coming and they have some plans. They just want to kind of keep it basic for now until we move to the next patch. Could be a thing.
Yeah. All right, you want to move on? Any brief touch on T1 after another solid week?
I mean, I'm always down to circle jerk T1 here on this show this season. Like, I just like, when I think about show ideas, I like go through like these bullet points, and then I'm like, there will be like the moment where we circle jerk T1 because they're amazing, and we're like, yeah, they were really good this week again. They were like really dominant. Another 4 a week for T1. Carrier played the Thresh, and like he's always been a good Thresh player. Remember when he was Thresh in the LCK opening, and then he comes back and he's the first Thresh player in the LCK, 100% win rate. Gets POG 008. Whoa, he won the lane super early against Sari, and then it was just over. It was done. any faker cask highlights. So they were on the front page of Reddit again. You know,
do you like Owner? Do you like Owner?
he's
Can I
really
remind
good
you?
at Lee Sin,
He's
isn't
really
he?
good at Lee Sin. He's now the score is now 41-5. He's chasing that. He's got 4 games, 4 wins till he hits that 90% Lee Sin win rate. Are we good? Is that the circle jerk? I don't know. They're still
I
fucking
mean,
good, guys. Here. I've got a slightly different take for you. Okay.
okay, all right, hit me with that.
Here's my new T1 take. They actually played front to back 5v5 team fighting this week against BRION.
Yeah,
That's not insignificant. That's not
yeah.
insignificant.
No, it's a different way of looking at it. They haven't always been doing that. They have
They
really
haven't
not been
played
doing
a
that a
lot of
lot.
it. They haven't played a lot of it this year. It's been mostly pick comps, mostly these skirmish comps, breaking people apart. We didn't know. I mean, we knew, but we didn't technically have evidence that they were super good at front to back 5v5 team fighting. Then they bust out, Gnar, Wukong, Gragas, Aphelios, Thresh, and we're like, oh, this is a very different style of composition. They can still do this, right?
Yeah, I'd also felt like it was a great week for Guma. Like Guma has been kind of overshadowed, and I think a lot of this week was him being empowered by Keria, but he did extremely well. That Varus game where he had the Renata Glass support, that was a really good look for him. Like he looked so insane in that game, and like on hit Varus, where sometimes we're not a big fan of that. It's like, why didn't you just play another 80 carry? And in this, this week of LCK, he was like, I'm not going to play on hit Varus. I'm just playing a different ADC. It's fine. But in this game, he played it with Renata. And the way they played this Sejuani comp, where they just like toss in CC and then just layer it. And the turn that was in BRION's comp was so good, but the Renata pick was sick because Keria just like says, all right, Sejuani ulted. I'm just going to drop my hostile takeover on top of it. So the enemy team's like running like, I'm going to save that guy who got hit by the Sejuani ult. And then everybody's berserked and then you can't actually win the fight. And his individual performance, on that Varus, like his positioning, his damage output was all insane. And we've had this conversation about like Guma, Deft, Viper, which 80 carry is the best. I've spent most of the season, since after like week 2, leaning towards Viper being the best. Deft's had a great week this week on Lucian again, unsurprisingly popping off. But like Guma really made a case for himself this week, I thought. And yeah, weaker opponents, but individually he looked really, really clean. And I thought that it almost felt like T1 was trying to big up him with the drafts they chose, where they're like, you actually kind of have to pop off a little bit. It's not just like Keria carries you in lane. You actually have to position well. You have to play this Aphelios well. You have to play this on-hit Varus very well in this comp, or we won't win. And he said, yeah, I will do it. I will win. I will play really well. So I thought like that for me was another standout because these front-to-back team fights don't work unless he plays extremely well, and he did.
Yeah, I also like the throwback to last year composition that T1 pulled out in game 2 with a Sejuani top and the Renata Glass support and the Viego jungle. That was really fun.
Now everybody copies them. Everybody's doing it now. Like they do it one time and like literally the whole LCK is like, oh, Viego Sejuani, that's a thing. We better pick that.
We remember how strong that combo was from last year, actually. We remember that. Yeah, I think that is very, very funny that we just get to have that back again, especially now that Viego seems to be more of a meta pick with a lot of these early game junglers. It's just been very well played by T1. So again, though, both the games versus BRION, it was a little bit more of the traditional front to back 5v5 team fighting, and that is new for T1 this year. That is new, and they looked absolutely awesome at that as well. So the questions we have about what are this team's weaknesses are rather rapidly dwindling.
Yeah. It's like, too bad they're not doing this last year where they are bringing all these old things back and doing like the great tour. Because last year was the 10-year anniversary of LCK. It would have been sick to just watch T1 do time travel through different metas and like make the new meta that go back a little bit. Like remember the Aphelios Jinx meta? Like let's go back to a little bit of Aphelios Thresh, like some Tom Kench maybe. Any Viego Sejuani enjoyers. They just have covered all the bases this season. It almost feels like they treat these series like scrims. Like, can we actually do what we've practiced in scrims in a series? Could just hide strats or just do something boring. But no, we're going to play Gragas mid and Jace. We're going to pick Gragas, Jace, and flex both of them. What are you going to do? Then they're like, okay, now everyone's doing that. It's boring. Let's do some Aphelios Thresh because like melee supports are back on the hot list. Let's do a little bit of that. Let's play some front to back team fighting. every single week. You don't know what you're going to get from T1, but you know it's going to be good. And you know it's going to be well prepared and it's going to be clean. And I hope that teams look at T1's consistent success here and are like, man, we should just keep our rosters for multiple seasons because it's really good to build that synergy. Yeah, just do that.
Well, I think
Maybe.
the problem is a lot of times the players themselves want to leave the teams or try and move on to greener pastures or have an idea that if they make the mix up with a different roster, it's going to be more promising in the
That
coming
also does
season.
happen, yeah. And we'll see because we'll talk about this probably a lot more at the end of summer season. But we do have the new LCK rules and agency
Oh,
things coming
God.
into play, so it's going to be a wild off season, and I don't think it's going to be like a good off season for the LCK. But we'll touch on that more when summer comes around. But when you have the power and the money, and the team likes each other as much as T1 does, you're just I don't know. I mean, it's just good. You're gonna keep growing. You're gonna keep building. And I think this year T1 like we should be looking forward to potentially them picking up an international title at least at MSI. Like right now, no one seems even close.
I agree.
So everyone's like, I'm worried they're just gonna choke at internationals again. I'm like, no, they didn't really choke that much. I mean, they choked a little bit, but I think that there were some clear
They did
flaws
choke a
that we
little
saw.
bit.
Yeah.
They did choke a
But,
little
but
bit.
there were also clear flaws that we saw, especially at MSI last year that came to the forefront. So
Well, T1 wasn't a favorite to win Worlds either by the time that rolled around. I mean, you were literally looking at they got swept in the finals in summer, and GenG was supposed to be the better team, right?
yeah,
So once you got to Worlds, they started looking more like the favorite, and obviously by the finals, they were definitely the favorite.
when I
But they did
see
also take MSI and World Finals to 5 games, so you can only choke so hard under those circumstances.
for when I see T1, like for some reason this week and a little bit last week, like I when I show up to work, like I enter through the parking garage, and sometimes I'm like going in right when T1's going in. It's just been a coincidence. I've like been in the elevator with them. And like the rapport that these players have, like they joke around with each other. They're like they're super close. Like you could just tell these guys love playing with each other. Like they really like each other. And sometimes with these like super teams, you get the feeling like, okay, these players don't like each other, but they're like, well, we're the
Sure.
best, so we're gonna play together. I just don't get that vibe from T1. And you see Faker always like thanks the driver and like comes up and like make sure everyone's got all their stuff. He's like the dad, and then you have like the four kids who are all just like goofing around and making jokes with each other and like talking about how like I mean, I don't want to share too much, but like talking about like what they feel about coming into the match, and somebody's talking about strats, or somebody's just like joking around, like we better not lose today, something like that. Just laughing and chuckling. And I just feel like this team is super happy, and happy teams that have like it's just we just keep adding all these things up. But like it's like okay, well, what if they hate each other? Sometimes we see these super teams doing really well, like their read on the meta is really great, but like I don't know, like something could happen. There could be some drama right before an international event or something. It usually happens on Western teams more than happens on Korean teams. This team likes each other. They have pre-built synergy. They have a better coaching staff. They really just straight up have coaches that are influencing the draft and the way this team is moving, like they did not have last year. Um, how can we predict anything but T1 winning MSI? And this is
Well,
not us like being too overhyped. I think it's realistic to just be like, no, they should do it. They should win.
what you're saying also reflects in their play because you have to have just an insane amount of trust within each other to play the way T1 does just via the eye test. I mean, the all-ins on these turret dives, the long-range engages, the inherent trust to follow up on a different player's play every single time. Like they go all in. If one player goes all in, they're all going all in, you know? And I think you really have to you have to have a very good team bond outside of the game in order to make that work. Otherwise, the trust just isn't there and the follow-up isn't there. So I think it does really bear through the eye test as well. And I think that's what's so insane about T1 right now. We can look at the statistics and they are exceptional in many ways, but the eye test is just so good on this team right now.
Yeah.
The eye test is bonkers. And you just don't know if you haven't watched every single game how adaptive they can be, how good their reads can be on the situation, the way that they push their limits. It really is just beautiful.
Yeah, it's it's a slam dunk every time. Like every single play is a highlight reel. That's like how it feels. Like every single play is like one that you put on the highlights. Like if you go back and watch like the T1 versus X highlights on YouTube too, they're usually pretty long. Even if it's a short game, because it's like every single play is just like flashy, but like in a good way. Not like a, oh, don't do that against a better team or you're gonna get dunked on. It's like no, just it's clean, but it's also impressive every time. But anyway, we were gonna circle jerk about T1 again next week, so we could probably move on.
Surprise! It's MonteCristo, and I'm here to thank FreezePipe for sponsoring Last Free Nation. You guys have been looking for a gift for yourselves for 420 in the next month. Now's the time to head on over and pick yourself up a FreezePipe as a treat. You guys can get pipes, bongs, dab rigs, bubblers, whatever you want. They've got it. And each of their finely crafted glass pieces contains a separate glycerin chamber. Pop that in the freezer an hour before you want to smoke, and you won't have a scorched back of your throat anymore. You'll have a much more smooth and pleasant experience. And of course, you guys can go over to www.thefreezepipe.com and use the promo code LFN. Of course, that's just the initials of Last Free Nation for a 10% discount at checkout. So come on over. Come now, go to thefreezepipe.com, use that promo code, and get yourself a better smoking experience. Bigger hits, less pain. That's what you get from FreezePipe.
Maybe we talk about the other telecom team now for a little bit.
Sure.
Talk about KT Rolster, who had a pretty good week, all things considered. The most impressive thing to me about what KT did, there's like two things. One is they beat GenG, right? But like, then they won, right, consistently, so they maintained form throughout the week. So that's like the first thing. That in itself is good, because you're always worried, is KT just going to randomly have terrible drafts or choke in a game that they should win, because that happens all the time. So great consistency, we got that part. And then the second part is they advanced their aggressive bot lane style, where Lehens is playing like Life did, and he's just playing Leona and just all in engaging all the time. And you're seeing Cuz play around that as well. Cuz has, I think, second highest counter jungle percentage in the LCK. Like, he always is on red side. He's on the enemy red buff like every time, every game, nonstop, no matter what. He's always trying to set up dives. And then when you put Lehens on Leona, and he's just going to Zenith Blade in off cooldown, this works extremely well. And I thought KT played around their advantages very well. The first game against who did they play yesterday? Why am I blanking on this?
Liiv SANDBOX.
Liiv SANDBOX. Yeah, the first game they got advantages, and then they kind of squandered a little bit. That was a little bit concerning. But beyond that game,
no. I think that's a mischaracterization. I don't think they squandered the advantages. They just didn't snowball as fast as you and I may have liked them to, but they were in control of that game start to finish. Like, could they have taken a Baron
5 minutes faster? Yes.
Could they have actually just turned on objectives after starting them? Yeah, instead of just trying to create picks before starting objectives with Ornal? Yes, they could have done all these things. But also, shout out to Liiv SANDBOX for having maybe the dumbest draft I've seen against KT this season, because we just saw last week, KT, when you ban Sejuani, when you ban her first pick Karma, when KT's on red side, you just first pick Karma on blue side, or when you take out the Jacks, they really struggled last week. And part of that was KT trying to pretend to be other teams as opposed to being themselves. And they definitely didn't have that problem this week, which I loved. But if you take Caitlyn, they're going to take Karma Ezreal.
Yeah.
And Karma Ezreal is the classic counter lane to Kate Lux. So you first pick Caitlyn as Liiv SANDBOX. They take, surprise Pikachu. They take Karma Ezreal, which is like, do not give Kate. This is the bot lane you do not want to give KT. And it's the matchup of that bot lane that you do not want to give KT. You take the Lux anyway. And then you take the Jace, but the Ornn is still up. And it's just like, the draft was just so fucking bad. And then on top of this, you then get clapped in the bot lane by the Karma Ezreal, give aiming an enormous advantage. They stack a million dragons, and then they just sit there waiting for you to fight them at objectives, and eventually they win the game.
Keen's trying to turn his Ornn ult into a sniper shot. Like he was trying.
That was bad. Okay, that was
He
terrible.
had some interesting calls. Like Burdol was kind of running it down, so Keen was like, "Where's Burdol? Can I kill him?" And like the answer was like usually yes. There was the one weird flash onto the Ornn horn where he missed it up and messed it up. That was like really painful. But
okay, did they play out the game perfectly? No. Did they still like dominate the Drakes, get the soul, win the game? Liiv SANDBOX only got 3 kills. Look, it was not a close game. It should have been a 32-minute game instead of a 38-minute game, but did it matter? No. At the end of the day, Liiv SANDBOX couldn't actually do anything against BDD's composition. KT got massively ahead. But I couldn't believe that Liiv SANDBOX would just grief this draft this badly.
Yeah,
because it's like they don't know KT at all. It's like they've never seen a KT game before. It's like this is literally the composition you don't give them. Have you watched BDD on Azir the last couple of weeks? That guy he shit on GenG. I mean, he shit on GenG.
Also, like aiming is 6-0 on Ezreal, or was before the series. Is 7-0 now. And they have played Karma basically every time it's been up.
Of course,
that's when they hard pound.
Perfect pick for KT. Yeah. This is Karma is the KT crutch. Okay. Yeah. What it does is it allows aiming to play late game AD carries without getting shoved in bot lane.
Yeah, he just gets free early game. It's just like a free pass. And
so you don't let them have it. You don't let them have
maybe I had a thought maybe in this draft that they would like draft Caitlyn Kalista or something, or do something like really crazy. They're like, oh, it's a trap. Like you pick the Karma and we're actually gonna prepare this other lane that will like really hard push this. Some sort of AD support. No, they didn't have a plan. And this is like where it gets wild to me in these drafts where we're seeing like outside of T1, right? Again, because they don't fall into the list of this. And I'd say also Dplus, because Dplus has specific picks they're very good at and they know how to navigate those drafts. But like we're seeing basically everybody else from 3rd to 6th kind of go like, let's try to do what T1 did here. And then they like mess it up, and then or they like fall into a trap because they don't know exactly how to do it. And they just have turned off their brains about what their opponents are good at, what their opponents' playstyles are, what they're good at, what their playstyles. KT had this last week really bad, where they, put aiming on Lucian. I'm like, this guy is really bad at this pick. He is not a strong AD carry player. He's not the player who's gonna push lane in and win super hard and then give you a good mid game. He needs to have 2 items plus going to the late game. He needs that. Now Lehens is trying to get him ahead in different ways now, which I think is cool. Lehens is flashing forward. He's playing Leon. He's playing the Karma with flash forward, trying to get roots and outplay his opponents because he knows they're the better lane, or the better duo rather. But the teams really are just turning their brains off, I think, in a lot of ways, being like, what's good here? I'm like, no, what's good? Like, not they're going down the tier list of like, what would T1 do? Kind of like drafting sometimes. I'm like, no, just you can't play that. You can't do that. Just play what's good for you, and also take away what's bad for your, or ban what your opponent's strengths are. Like, move past that. Don't let the Karma through, because you're like taking away Gragas here. Like, what are you doing? Like, what is that for? Like, oh, T1 would flex that there. I'm like, yeah, maybe they would, but like you're playing against KT. Like, I don't know, man. Liiv SANDBOX. I guess we can't talk about KT without talking about Liiv SANDBOX.
I'm going to talk about a little bit more about KT before Liiv.
Okay, all right.
Because here's the thing. KT went back to their strengths this week, as we said. They did it in the GenG game as well. The Twisted Fate last pick, not a champion we've seen a lot in this meta, but BDD has constantly been good at that champion throughout his career. Actually, brilliant pick into a colleague because it sees through a shroud. Really shut down Chovy in that game. Also sees through the Wukong stealth on his W. And they played through their win conditions in that game super, super well. So I think it was a very legit win from KT over GenG. They actually pulled out some new tricks and had a very successful red side draft in the 3rd game of the series. So KT looked good. They look legit good this week.
In that TF game, I felt like my read on how that game was going to go, like I look back on that cast and I'm like, I really just didn't think that they were going to win it. I was like, oh, they didn't do enough with this Twisted Fate. Like, I didn't see how the team fights were going to go later on in the game. But when you actually see how basically KT turned that game into like a chess stalemate, where they were like, oh yeah, you're going to take the objective. You can't turn with this comp into us. We have Twisted Fate, so you can't start it. And like, we're going to clear vision around it, just kind of group. And it was amazing to watch KT not panic around Chovy side laning, because they're like, there's a limit to how much you can push. You've taken out the inner on top, you've taken out the inner on bottom, but you can't push our inhibitor turrets, and you can't farm up there. So like, Chovy keeps going up, and he's like, I'm a Kali, I'm going to split push, and they're like, yeah, but you're in a Kali. You can't kill our turrets that fast. You can't get the inhibitor. So they never panicked. They just let Chovy go. They were like, yeah, you can go up there, that's fine. We're going to sit on this Baron, and you have to come down, or we will start the Baron. We have amazing turn. And then eventually, like, Chovy broke, and he had that really terrible teleport right on top of BDD, and he just had to instantly stopwatch and then died. I felt like the patience we saw from KT, like, we very rarely have seen this across multiple rosters for KT over the last few years. That kind of decisiveness where they're like, we're playing this comp, we're really good at this comp, we fully understand this comp, and we're not just going to go chase this Akali and then lose control of Baron. Because I think if you tunnel on trying to kill Chovy there, you go top and you try to kill him, he maybe gets away, and then GenG get position on Baron, then they win the Baron fight, they get Baron, they win the game. KT were just so calm in this really high pressure situation. I really didn't think they were going to do it. I was like, no, it's done. Like, this Akali's fed, this Twist of Fate doesn't do damage. But no, they really handled that situation so incredibly well. I was impressed with that. I was impressed with how they played out the first game draft, where they got massive leads with Lehens again. Like, the KT is just looking to be at their best, insanely strong. Oh, the worry always is, will they keep that form? Like, will they actually? Were they just lucky this week? Are we like reading too much into this? Like, I hope not, and I don't think so. But like, maybe next week we just see them go back to this terrible drafting, and we're like, why do you do this to me, KT?
Yeah, I think this game was good because they didn't really have to make picks in the early game, because they were able to so successfully control the mid lane. And they kept the mid outer turret up for a long time in this game, which kind of allowed them to play GenG super, super well. Like, the thing is, GenG has to group at some point in time. And KT, if they have good vision control, and the thing about KT is they always have very good vision control around Baron or Drake. They usually have 4+ control wards, 4 or 5 control wards around these objectives. So their vision control, specifically in River, has been very strong this season. And so all they have to do is kind of jostle GenG, because GenG's constantly trying to like move out to, as you're saying with Chovy, to clear out the side lanes or to push the side lanes. And then they have to move back into the objective. And all KT has to do is catch them in rotation. And Chovy just has no way to live. I mean, if that TF ult is up, he can't shroud. He can't hide in shroud. And he's dealing with Gold Card, Vi ult, Chains of Corruption from Varus, Leona ult. Even if he isn't shrouding, get hit by Leona ult, or an empowered Renekton Q, right? The single target CC, every champion on KT's composition has single target CC. So if anybody's out of position, they're just dead. They're just dead. So I love this comp from KT. I love the way they played it. I think they played the map super intelligently. It was probably the single like best execution that I've seen from KT so far this season. It was really masterful.
Yeah. That's the kind of game that gives you hope that this team has like so much more in the tank. Like, they have good strats, and maybe we haven't seen as much as this because they're trying to like keep it hidden, keep it close to the chest. I don't know. We did see BD play Twisted Fate early in the season and find success on it too, but that was like, 5-6 weeks ago now. So we know they could play this style well. They proved it again. And KT, weirdly, if they can maintain this form and if they can continue to draft like this, seem like a really scary team in a best of 5. Especially because they don't seem fatigued either in these long games. They're making the right calls. They're not choking. Because that's how they beat GenG the last time, too. It was a really long game 3 where they were super patient, and then one mistake out of Chovy, they collapse on him, they kill him, and like, that's kind of KT's MO against GenG in these longer games, because it's like the strongest team they've been able to bring to a longer game like this. So kind of a scary playoff team when you think about it. in that first round, if you're facing KT, like they have a lot of different strats, they have a few different styles of play. The one thing you're probably not going to get is like strong side aiming. Like he's probably not going to play Draven. He's probably not going to play Lucian. You're going to be able to ban
He's had
Karma.
some pretty fire Draven games. I don't know.
I'm not ready to trust, but
I'm
not ready to trust.
Good Draven games, but I do think that KT at the very least, and BDD honestly, and like you guys have to remember, I'm BDD's #1 hater historically, and I have to say he was amazing this week. He had a really good week. He looks like he's coming into form at the right time. So even individually, I think these players are doing well because so much of this season has been about Keen's performance, particularly on Jax. But now BDD has been good, but BDD truly had his best week of the season, I think, this last week, and that made a big difference.
Oh, for sure. Whenever he locks in Talia, I'm like, one part of my heart is like, oh, they're probably gonna choke. But the other part of my heart is like, well, BDD's so good at Talia. What if he pops off? And then that game 2 yesterday, it's just going past the dragon pit, hitting every shove and lane into an Azir, and just constantly forcing closer back. Like he was clean. And I mean, BDD for me has always been like the reputation was bigger than what I saw for a lot of my time casting BDD, right? Because I've known this player for forever because he was so iconic. He has had so many great years across many different organizations. And then in Worlds, I think it was 2021 Worlds, where he almost went to the finals and then like choked that semis away. He was both like super clutch in that semis, but also then like completely through and overextended and then like lost them that semis. But there was that series for me where I was like, okay, BDD really has it in him. And then he really didn't. But like the good part of that, I was like, BDD could be like really top 3 mids in the LCK, like solidly. Because it's always been like Faker, Chovy, and then whoever else is going around is usually Showmaker, but there's, some other mids stepping into the spotlight. And then I haven't felt that way about BDD until basically this week also. Like, I'm like, oh man, he really has it in him. Can he do it every week? This is the question we always have to ask, but we know he can do it. Like, this is a big proving week for him. So.
Yeah, I guess I didn't read too much into KT's losses last week because it just felt like, first off, they played T1. And then second off, their loss to Dplus felt like more them, like we've talked about, giving up on their own style, whereas we saw a lot more of the KT that I expected to see last week this week, and that does give me some level of renewed hope.
Yeah. My worry about those losses is that, like, because they do randomly lose like this, and it feels somewhat randomly. Yes, tough opponents, but like the drafting style just seemed so boneheaded that, like, who's to say they don't just do this next week though? Who's to say they don't? And like, we, after watching this week, I'm like, they should not do it. It should be okay, right? It should be fine. But then, we'll have to wait and see, right? So
it's also that KT, their last few matches of the season are relatively easier opponents. Like, their only challenging opponent left is Hanhwa Life, and then they play BRION, Kwangdong, and DRX. So we also might get a very bad read on KT going to the playoffs because there's a realistic opportunity for them just to 4-0 these last matches. They end up 13-5 in potentially like a second seed. I mean, they certainly, with their strength of schedule, have the chance to get the #2 seed in the league, which is pretty crazy because they're only one game back on Dplus and GenG, and they have a very easy schedule.
All it takes is one big upset. Speaking of upsets and talking about like slipping in the
You want to talk about
standings.
Vitality?
No, I want to talk about. That was good one, Dad. I want to talk about Liiv SANDBOX because I don't think there's any chance BRION is going to make it in. Because BRION basically has to 2-0 everything, and Liiv SANDBOX basically has to 0-2 everything. But I have no hope for Liiv SANDBOX anymore. I'm just going to say it.
I told you they were frauds, Wolf. I told you.
And you know what? You were right. And Atlas is also, like, Atlas has been telling us since like day one, like, no, this team is actually just it's actually just a mirage. Like, it's actually just an
Dude,
idea. Like you guys are like, oh, Wheeler's so good, but is
Burdol
he
just
actually
gets
that good?
worse and worse, man. Burdol just gets worse and worse.
Yeah. That was my concern. We've talked about this, like, it feels like for the last 4 weeks. I feel like we have to have like a short segment. You know, you could just timestamp at the Burdol discussion, like in the YouTube VOD, and like if you want to just skip to like us being like, I'm worried about Burdol again, you just click on that part and watch that part of the VOD because we talk about this every week, and it gets worse and worse every time. His performances are really bad, and he's an emotional player. Like, I think he has serious stage anxiety, and that's something that the coaching staff needs to either figure out, or maybe they need to look for a new top laner, because we've seen this across multiple rosters. But beyond that, like, Liiv SANDBOX just choked super hard in games they had control over, like their Nongshim series that was incredibly long for no reason because they just forgot how to shot call or fight for objectives. Like, what happened to this team? We are not watching the same
Dude,
team.
It's even the basic game reads that Liiv SANDBOX have that make me really lose hope. Because let's take Liiv SANDBOX versus KT game 1. You're Willer. Your bot lane of Kate and Lux wants to push up. You know they're going to push up. Why are you not covering your lane when Cuz is ganking them after starting topside at level 3? He literally walks through the jungle. It is textbook for a Wukong in the Vi matchup. The Wukong can look to fight the Vi on second buff. If they're both level 3, Wukong typically wins that engagement. So Wukong can invade at level 3 when Vi, and all he does is check red buff and then walk behind Caitlyn and Lux that are pushed up. Willer's just not there. He's just at Raptors. Like, you know that this play is a possibility. You know the Wukong can walk in on you. And if he's going to walk in on you and he doesn't find you at red buff, you know what he's going to do? Go kill your lane that's been pushed up. You
Yeah.
give aiming in hands a massive advantage in a lane matchup that's already good for them. It was just so disgustingly predictable. And I say this as somebody who legitimately thinks that Willer has been a top 3 jungler within the league, within LCK this split. You have to read your win conditions better. Holy shit. Like,
Yeah,
come on.
or if you are the Caitlyn Lux and Willer is not shadowing your lane, then you can't be up like that. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm more defending Envy for this move because your win condition is to try to push this lane in, right? Like, that's what you're functionally trying to do. And then your jungler doesn't back you up, so there's like a miscommunication there, disconnect. I think the team is going through some stuff internally. It seems like we're like shot calling is just falling apart and nobody wants to trust each other. I don't know what it is. Willer still seems positive on stage and stuff like that. Like, he's always got a smile on his face. So maybe he's actually just an insane person and just happy all the time, while the rest of the team is like, I want Willer to stop being happy, man. This is not good. This is a terrible situation. I don't know what's going on, but the team's shot calling, win condition reading, team fighting, objective setup, it's all just gone in the toilet. And this to me was, of the top 6 teams, like, you know, or let's say 2 to 6 teams, the one thing I really liked for Liiv SANDBOX in the middle of the season always was their mid game setup on objectives, decisive shot calling, and engaging. Like, they were always like, snap, I'm going in on this person. We're going to set up this team fight. Willer's Wukong is going to hit a massive cyclone, or we're going to turn incredibly well. We're going to set up a vision trap in this brush. They were so decisive, which was weird because this is a team full of players that have historically not been clutch or decisive at all. And so it was strange, but I was like, oh man, this team has some magic on it. These players are young and they're just like playing with reckless abandon, but it's working. And I think that's why a lot of people thought they were fraudulent, because like, can they really do this? And like, should they be doing this? And is Willer good, or is he just randomly getting these crazy steals? Like, there was some questions back then. But I always thought, like, from 20 to 25 minutes, that was the sweet spot for Liiv SANDBOX. They are really going to fight on those objectives hard. They're going to do it right, and it's going to be clean, and you're going to be like, wow, that was just good, straight up 5v5 on an objective, or setting a trap to turn it into a 5v4 or a 5v3 by getting 2 picks with this Wukong. And now we're just seeing this team like seem completely lost, not setting up for objectives, not side laning, losing insides. Burdol is losing lane basically no matter what. Even if he starts out with a lead, he'll probably randomly go somewhere on the map and die, unfortunately. And maybe that's the main problem is Burdol, you can't trust him. He keeps dying, and the team is like, oh, we can't do these objectives now, or all Burdol's caught, or all Burdol doesn't have flash, we can't do this anymore. Maybe that's what's going on, but I'm just really sad because this team that had so much potential and was playing really well was such an interesting part of the LCK. now it just feels like a walkover win for the rest of the season. And all the remaining Liiv SANDBOX matches that were kind of like, ooh, that was going to be interesting. Now it feels like, oh no, it's just a freebie.
I don't know if I go that far. Like, I think for
I'm
me,
ready to go that far.
you know, Envy has had increasingly good laning phases, and he's kind of a win more ADC because he positions so aggressively that when he's ahead, he can really dominate team fights. I think they do the best when they play with like a bunch of shields around Envy, where he's got like a fat, shield bow plus bloodthirster plus a bunch of plus an Annie shield on him, right? Just frontlining for the team and pumping out damage. So I really like the way Envy plays, but you do have kind of like live by Envy and die by Envy. So Liiv SANDBOX, look, they play GenG, DRX, BRION, and Hanhwa Life. They probably win 2 of those. Maybe they have a chance at an upset, but realistically, they should be on the bottom end of the spectrum. Maybe they can squeak back past Hanwha Life if Hanwha loses a bunch of these games to finish out the season, but it'll be hard.
I also think the meta is not, excuse me, the meta is not good for closer. Like it's a little bit tougher to just play a Kali every game right now.
Yeah, he's a mid lane melee specialist basically.
Yeah,
I know
so
people like to talk about his Azir, but his Azir is nowhere good as his like whatever Yone, his Akali, his Sylas, these picks.
His Gragas, his Annie, these are not picks that like those picks right now where like you have to be so good at them to actually be a top mid laner in the LCK, and like it's just not his play style. Maybe he can get there, right? But he's not the hard engage Annie, like Flash Tibbers hide in a brush type player. He's not the Gragas cask engage and sit back and just farm up a tier and farm up a Rod of Ages. Like that's not who he is. That's not what he's good at. And it was cool because when he was on T1, like Faker was that, and then Closer was like, all right, if you need like the melee specialist, I'll play this. And like that was for a little while there, it felt like, oh, that's so sick that they have Faker and Closer on the same team, because if they want to play something else, they can just put Closer in. But as it turns out, like it doesn't really work like that in mid lane, because you don't know what draft you're going to get, you don't know what counter pick you're walking into. So Closer got eventually removed from that team after also choking a bit back then. But he needs to get like the control mage stuff shored up here in this meta, because if we continue to go down this path where Akali Sylas is not as free win for him as it used to be, like he used to like straight up just draw bans and Liiv SANDBOX would win draft because he would get Akali banned against him, a Sylas banned against him, and the enemy team would like trade those 2 bans for an Azir ban and be like, he was like, yeah, cool, now we're winning the solo lanes, we have actually like the counter pick set up. Not happening anymore. So something needs to change for this roster, and it might be too late. Might be too late. I'm very low on this team right now. I mean, I don't think they're going to drop out of playoffs. Like I'm not that low, but otherwise, pretty much like solidly in 6th. The same way I put Hanwha solidly 1 tier above them, I put them like definitely 6th place. Definitely 6th.
I think the revitalization of Lee Sin and Viego may help Willer a bit, because he's historically been good at those champions, but this season he's just been on like Wukong duty basically, and he has been maybe the best Wukong in the league. I think he probably is the best Wukong in the LCK. But he's been mostly playing like Wukong, Sejuani, Maokai, and some Vi, and his Vi really hasn't been great. So I would like to see more Lee Sin and more Viego from him, which have been historically strong champions going back to the Hanwha days.
I wonder, Rich is a free agent now. He just left his team under like unknown circumstances, I guess. He was like, it was amicable, but he's like, I can't really talk about it. But he's back in Korea now. Because I was thinking about this for the last few weeks, like who could replace Burdol? Because there's not a lot of great free agents. And even like the ones that you would think about that are like floating out there a lot of the time, like Hoya, he's like also not available, right? He's gone to the LPL. So I'm like, maybe you could give Rich a shot here for like a 1 season contract, like Prince last year, right? Where he comes in summer and like the whole team changes. I could see Rich doing well on this roster. I don't know if he might be like too old and too experienced to trust this team. Like I could see Rich being like, oh, these kids, man, these cool kids who never panic. He's like, that's not my mantra. But I don't know, I could see it. Maybe make a phone call, Liiv SANDBOX. Maybe make a phone call.
Maybe they should call DRX and get them some rascal. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
make a trade. Let's make a trade.
You receive money, we receive rascal.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say no to that. I wouldn't say no to that. All right. The bottom teams basically are done at this point. If we're being realistic, like technically BRION isn't eliminated, but not only would Liiv SANDBOX have to lose their remaining 4 matches, BRION would have to win their remaining 4 matches. And also, BRION is now at a -11 game differential. So basically, what we're saying is Liiv SANDBOX would have to go like 0-8, and BRION would have to go 8-0 in games in order to like basically make up that difference. It's not quite that severe, but it also, what my point is that the game differential also has to be made up there. Because as of right now, Liiv SANDBOX is actually at a +1 compared to the -11 of BRION. So,
so
it seems
12.
extremely unlikely, especially since BRION has to play KT, Dplus, and Liiv SANDBOX. So they're not likely to win that. The only one they'd be favored is Nongshim.
There's like basically
two.
There's basically 2. I guess if we like think about it, like there's about 2 games that BRION could lose or Liiv SANDBOX could win, and then it's done. So
yeah. Liiv SANDBOX also have to lose to DRX, which not likely.
Not likely.
You're so down on Liiv SANDBOX. Look, I thought they were fraudulent. You're just like, you completely 180 on this team. They're not that bad, okay?
They're not that bad, but yeah, no, I don't think they'll lose to DRX. But
and as for the rest of the teams, everything is in flux right now. It really feels like first place is basically sewn up for T1, particularly because they have matches against Nongshim and DRX remaining, which they will absolutely smash. And if they win 2 more matches, they're actually just out of reach. They're 15-1, and nobody else can get more than 14 wins. So T1 is basically sewn up for first place. But considering that we have 4 teams at either 10-4 or 9-5, that's where it starts to get really interesting for the rest of this race.
Yeah, second place is really important because you just go straight into double them. So that race is really anyone's to take. We don't know yet. It seems based on remaining schedule that Dplus KIA is most likely, also based on GenG's recent performances, most likely to get it, but we will see. I believe they have that matchup against GenG. Yeah, it's on week 9, so not next week, but the following week. It's one of our last matches. So that one is really important for those 2 teams, but also all the remaining matches. If GenG loses to Liiv SANDBOX randomly, I don't think that's going to happen, but I don't want to predict that right now, but then Dplus's chances get even higher. So yeah, it feels like we have some pretty hype matches over the next 2 weeks, especially in week 9. But any upsets across that top 6 means that there's a chance that, Dplus doesn't get that second spot, or GenG doesn't get that second spot. Maybe KT gets that second spot. That doesn't mean they're going to MSI. It just means they're skipping that first round, just to put that in context for people.
Yeah, KT, by the way, if they beat Hanhwa Life in their next match, they play BRION, Kwangdong, and DRX. And yeah, we know KT can lose to shitty teams, but if they beat Hanhwa, their fate is basically in their own hands. They have by far the easiest schedule of the remaining good teams in this league, whereas Hanhwa has the hardest, and then everyone else is kind of in between.
Yeah,
but KT really can control their own fate here.
Dplus though are 7 games ahead of them, so like if in order to get KT to get second, like Dplus has to lose a game, and they have tougher opponents, like you said, but they also have to lose with a score line.
Yeah, but if they lose worse. 2 games and Dplus plays T1 and GenG in the final week, if they lose both of those, then that doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, right? No, true.
So
it's definitely possible.
Like KT should absolutely be gunning for the the remaining 4 wins. That seems really doable for them. That seems really doable.
Especially with Hanwha's performance this last week. Like, I think that I haven't done my preds for the week yet, but I definitely right now I'm feeling like a pretty easy KT pred.
I got a bit of whiplash because Hanhwa's game against Nongshim was just so good. They really just completely dominated Nongshim Red Force, and it was really just a beautiful execution from Hanhwa Life, but we did get taken back down to earth a bit by the Dplus series.
Yep. Next week's games again. Nothing really special, but let's see how these top teams perform.
KT Hanwha's pretty good. Liiv SANDBOX versus GenG is pretty good. T1 versus Hanwha. Remember, that's T1's only loss. Can they do it again? There's a lot of good questions here.
Yeah, there are questions, and like it's unfortunate that we have a lot of like nothing games, so to speak, because of how quickly playoffs was decided this season. But we just had a clear top 6 and a clear bottom 4, so there are going to be a few games that are for fun.
Here's the thing, Wolf. I can deal with this because we have the top 6 teams are all going to playoffs and they're clearly a cut above, and those matches are all going to be super exciting. So I would rather have some crap, meaningless games at the end of the split and have a banger playoffs than have, teams that are 50% headed to playoffs. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is definitely the better end result. It just means there are going to be some Nongshim versus Kwangdong matches along the way that I will have to commentate, but you will not have to watch, Monty. So
I will be watching them. I tell you, man, I'm not going to be watching those games. You are correct. Monty
I will be
not
watching them and analyzing them. All right, I'll be laser focused. Okay, I'll be doing narrative commentary as well about what it means for these two teams and their improvement. We're doing all the color caster things.
I admit, Wolf, I will be watching Top Esports and LNG versus JDG this next week, EDG versus Weibo. These are the matches I will be watching instead of the ones you just mentioned. EDG, there's some bangers. There's some bangers in LPL.
I did watch JDG versus OMG last night because the games ended so fast. And I was very worried about the way that it went.
Really?
For Ruler. No, I mean, I care about Ruler because he's from the LCK. I'm not saying that Ruler individually had like a worrying performance, but yeah, bit of question marks for that team for me. I haven't watched the LPL that much because I can't, because it's not at the same time as LCK. But I watched that game and I was like, feeling pretty good about chances of an LCK team winning MSI at this moment in time.
All right. Well, guys, I think that's going to do it for our show for this week. Any parting thoughts, Wolf? We're kind of in playoffs waiting mode, it feels like.
Yeah, I'm ready to get there. I wish we could skip some of the middling matches. I mean, it's important for these teams to play their final games and like have their play themselves off the stage, so to speak. But I am mostly looking forward to playoffs, and we got some banger matches sprinkled in there at least to make up for it. So, all right,
I'll tell you what, Wolf. Next week on our show, we'll do our top 3 players in every position for the split.
That's a good idea.
Because the split's going to be almost over. Technically, I guess some players their position might change based on the final week of competition. But truly, guys, the matches this next week are not going to be super spectacular. So we might as well do something more interesting next week. And I think, some teams may be hiding strats or what have you. So we'll touch on that a little bit, but we can also just kind of make our pre-arguments for who we think the top players were. How about that?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Well, thanks guys for watching. We will see you next week.